I knew the HOA in this neighborhood was aggressive, but I didn't expect them to stab my tires over it. It started 3 weeks ago when I moved into my new house, a quiet little place at the end of the cul-de-sac. I liked the neighborhood well enough, except for one thing: the homeowners association. They weren't just strict, they were cult-like. Within days of moving in, I had a woman named Nancy Thornfield knocking on my door, armed with a clipboard and a fake smile. "Xander Whitlow, right?" she asked, glancing at my mailbox like she was confirming my existence. "That's me," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm the president of the Oak Ridge HOA, and we need to discuss your membership," she said, eyes narrowing slightly. "This is a mandatory participation neighborhood." I raised an eyebrow. That's funny, because when I bought this house, I specifically checked to make sure it wasn't part of any HOA. Her smile faltered for a split second before she recovered. "Oh, well, that's just a misunderstanding. You see, all homeowners here are expected to join. It helps keep the community in order." I crossed my arms. "I'm not interested." Nancy's expression hardened. "It's not optional." "It is for me," I said. "I don't need anyone telling me what color my blinds should be or how often I mow my lawn." Her nostrils flared, but she forced another tight smile. "I'll give you some time to reconsider." I shut the door before she could say anything else. That should have been the end of it, but over the next few weeks I started noticing little things. A warning letter in my mailbox about unauthorized trash bins, a complaint about the color of my front door beige, the same as half the houses on the block, then a bogus fine for failure to maintain landscaping when I had freshly mowed my lawn the day before. I ignored them all. Then last night happened. I was heading out for a late-night grocery run when I noticed my truck sitting at an odd angle. My stomach sank as I walked up and saw all four tires were completely flat. Not just slashed, stabbed, deep gashes running through the rubber like someone had gone at them with a kitchen knife. I clenched my jaw, pulling out my phone to call a tow. That's when I spotted something near my mailbox, a printed letter in a plastic sleeve taped to the post. "Perhaps now you'll reconsider joining. HOA dues ensure safety and security in the neighborhood." No signature, but I didn't need one. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. They had no idea who they were messing with. Because what Nancy and her little HOA minions didn't know was that I wasn't just some stubborn new homeowner. I was the mayor of this city. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my home office, staring at the letter taped to my mailbox, now laying on my desk. The audacity of it all was almost impressive. Almost. They thought intimidation would work, that I'd just roll over and pay their made-up dues like some scared suburbanite. They had no idea the kind of fight they just picked. At dawn, I made my first call to the police department. I wasn't after some half-hearted vandalism report. I wanted an investigation. My position as mayor didn't give me the power to order one directly, but it did mean I had the connections to make sure this wasn't ignored. Within an hour, an officer was at my house, taking photos of the slashed tires, inspecting the note, and listening as I laid everything out. The officer, a grizzled man named Detective Rollins, nodded along with a knowing look. "We've had issues with this HOA before," he admitted. "Nothing ever sticks, though. They're careful." I leaned back in my chair, tapping my fingers against my desk. "They're not careful enough. They left a paper trail." Rollins raised an eyebrow. "You have more than just this letter." I pulled up my laptop, opening the folder I had compiled over the last few weeks. Photos of the bogus violation notices, timestamps on every letter they had left, and security footage from my porch camera showing Nancy and another HOA board member loitering near my property the night before. While the footage didn't capture the act itself, it was enough to make them primary suspects. Rollins let out a low whistle. "That's a decent start, but we'll need more to press charges." I already had a plan for that. After he left, I made my next move. They wanted to play dirty? Fine. I had resources they couldn't even dream of. By midday, I was sitting in a conference room at City Hall with my legal team. My attorney, Vanessa Chen, was reviewing the documents I had brought in, her sharp eyes scanning every line. "This HOA is operating under the assumption that they can annex properties into their jurisdiction without legal backing," she said. "That's not how it works." I leaned forward. "Can we shut them down?" Vanessa's lips curled slightly. "Not immediately, but we can hit them where it hurts financially and legally. If we can prove they've been extorting homeowners under false pretenses, we can push for a full-scale investigation." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. I spent the rest of the afternoon making calls, first to the city's zoning commission, then to the local news station. If the HOA wanted to operate in the shadows, I was about to drag them into the spotlight. By the time evening rolled around, I had a full strategy in place. Step 1, gather more evidence. Step 2, turn their own community against them. Step 3, dismantle their entire operation. And I already knew exactly how to start. The next morning, I walked straight into the Oak Ridge HOA's monthly board meeting. It was held in the neighborhood clubhouse, a building I technically had no right to enter according to them, but I wasn't in the mood to play by their rules. The room fell silent as I stepped inside. Nancy was seated at the head of a long table, surrounded by her fellow board members, each one looking as smug and self-important as she did. Nancy's eyes narrowed. This meeting is for HOA members only. I set a thick folder down on the table. Good thing I'm not here to participate, I'm here to expose you. Murmurs rippled through the room as I opened the folder, pulling out copies of the complaint letters, the violation notices, and most damning of all the security footage of Nancy skulking around my driveway the night my tires were slashed. Nancy's face paled. This is ridiculous," she stammered. "You have no proof of anything." I slid another document toward her. "This is a formal request for an audit of your financial records. Turns out, the city has been getting complaints about your mandatory dues for years, and now they have a reason to dig deeper." One of the board members, a balding man with a nervous expression, shifted uncomfortably. "You can't just barge in here and—" I cut him off. "Actually, I can, and if you think this is bad, just wait until the news station runs the story tonight." Panic flickered across Nancy's face. She shot a look at the other board members, silently pleading for support, but cracks were already forming. A few of them looked uneasy, their confidence wavering. I leaned forward, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "You thought you could bully me into submission. You thought you could get away with intimidation and vandalism, but you made one crucial mistake." Nancy swallowed hard. "And what's that?" I smiled. "You picked a fight with the mayor." Nancy's grip tightened on the arms of her chair. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on, and I could see the cracks spreading across her carefully constructed mask of authority. The other board members weren't rallying to her defense. In fact, a few of them were pointedly avoiding eye contact, shifting in their seats like they wanted to be anywhere but here. I let the silence stretch, watching as she struggled to regain control, but there was no way out of this, not for her. One of the board members, a wiry woman with short silver hair, cleared her throat. "Let's not be hasty," she said, her voice measured. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." I cut her off with a sharp glance. "There's no misunderstanding. Your president has been running this HOA like a personal fiefdom, using intimidation and vandalism to enforce rules that have no legal standing. And now, the city is involved." Nancy's lips parted, but no words came out. The board member beside her, a man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, adjusted them nervously. "What exactly is it you want?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. "What I want," I said, leaning forward, "is to make sure this HOA never pulls anything like this again. You've been extorting homeowners under false pretenses, and that ends today." Nancy finally found her voice. "You can't just dismantle the HOA, she snapped, though there was an unmistakable tremor in her tone. "We have authority here, we maintain order." I didn't bother holding back my laughter. "Authority?" I repeated. "You don't have any real authority. You've been bullying people into compliance, feeding them lies about mandatory membership. But legally, you have no jurisdiction over my property or anyone else who didn't sign an agreement when they moved in." Her face was turning red now, frustration and fear warring for dominance. She knew I was right, and worse, she knew she had no way to counter it. The man with the glasses exhaled slowly. "If that's true," he said, glancing at Nancy, "then we have a serious problem." "No," Nancy snapped, "we can fix this, we just need to." "Step down." The words came from the silver-haired woman, and everyone turned to look at her. She folded her hands in front of her, her expression unreadable. "You've brought too much heat onto us, Nancy. This is beyond repair. If you step down, maybe we can salvage what's left." Nancy's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're siding with him." "I'm siding with reason," the woman replied. "We can't afford a legal battle with the city, and if the news gets involved, our reputations will be dragged through the mud." The other board members exchanged uneasy glances, but one by one, they nodded in agreement. Nancy shot up from her chair, her hands slamming against the table. "I built this HOA," she hissed. "I made this community what it is." I crossed my arms. "Then it's poetic that you'll be the one to watch it fall." Her chest rose and fell rapidly, and for a moment I thought she might lunge at me. But then, without another word, she stormed out of the room, the door slamming shut behind her. A heavy silence followed. The silver-haired woman sighed, "This is going to be a mess." I nodded, "But it's one you'll have to clean up without her." The man with the glasses adjusted them again. "What happens now?" "Now," I said, stepping back from the table, "the city audits your financials, and if there's any sign of fraud, you'll be held accountable. If you want to avoid that, I suggest you start cooperating." They didn't argue, they didn't even try. I had ones. The fallout was swift. Within a week, Nancy officially resigned from the HOA, though it wasn't exactly voluntary. The other board members had turned on her completely, eager to distance themselves from the mess she had created. The city's audit uncovered a slew of financial irregularities, nothing outright criminal, but enough to warrant serious fines and legal consequences. And the best part, the residents, once too afraid to speak out, were finally standing up for themselves. Without Nancy's iron grip, the HOA's influence crumbled. Homeowners who had been forced into paying bogus dues started demanding refunds. Others who had been unfairly fined were filing complaints. By the end of the month, the HOA was functionally dead. As for Nancy, she disappeared from the neighborhood entirely. Rumor had it she sold her house and moved to another town. Good riddance. I stood on my front porch one evening, watching as a group of neighbors gathered down the street, laughing and talking freely in a way they never had before. The oppressive atmosphere that had once suffocated this community was gone. And all it had taken was someone willing to stand up to them. I smiled to myself, stepping back inside. It was over, and I had won. The neighborhood was finally breathing again. With Nancy gone and the HOA's grip shattered, people started reclaiming their homes in ways they never could before. Driveways were no longer meticulously policed, front yards blossomed with colors once deemed unauthorized, and for the first time in years, residents weren't living under a cloud of fear. But there was one last thing left to do. The city audit had uncovered financial irregularities, but nothing outright criminal, at least not yet. However, I wasn't convinced that Nancy had walked away without stuffing her pockets first. That woman had been running the HOA like a dictatorship, and no dictator leaves power without ensuring a golden parachute. So I kept digging. While the HOA board scrambled to pick up the pieces, I turned my attention to their past financial records. Some of them had been conveniently misplaced during the transition, but I had my contacts at City Hall pull every document they could find. What I found was a pattern, one that stank of fraud. Nancy had been funneling HOA funds into a separate account, one that didn't appear in the standard financial reports. Small amounts at first, just enough to avoid suspicion, but over the years those withdrawals had grown. Thousands of dollars had been siphoned away under vague expense reports, with no real explanation as to where the money had gone. I wasn't the only one who noticed. One evening, as I was reviewing the documents in my office, my phone rang. It was Vanessa, my attorney. I answered immediately. "You were right," she said without preamble. "Nancy wasn't just running a predatory HOA, she was embezzling." That was all I needed to hear. The next morning, I met with Detective Rollins at the police station. He looked over the documents I had compiled, his expression growing darker with each page he flipped through. When he finally set them down, his jaw was tight. "This is more than enough to open an official investigation," he said. "If this checks out, she's looking at felony charges." That was exactly the outcome I wanted. Rollins wasted no time. Within days, a full investigation was underway, and it didn't take long before the truth started coming out. Nancy had been skimming HOA funds for years, using them to finance personal expenses, a country club membership, expensive vacations, even a second property in a neighboring town. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Residents who had once been bullied into paying outrageous dues were livid. The very people Nancy had lorded over were the ones now celebrating her downfall. It didn't take long before the authorities caught up with her. She had tried to disappear, but greed makes people sloppy. When the police finally tracked her down, she was staying in a luxury condo she had purchased with stolen HOA funds. The arrest made the evening news. There was something poetic about seeing her led away in handcuffs, her once smug face twisted in shock and outrage as reporters swarmed her with questions. With Nancy out of the picture for good, the remnants of the HOA crumbled completely. The board members, desperate to avoid further legal trouble, voted to dissolve the organization entirely. And just like that, Oak Ridge was finally free. The night the dissolution was finalized, the neighborhood threw a massive block party, something that would have been unthinkable under Nancy's rule. Families gathered in the streets, music played, and for the first time in years, people felt like they truly owned their homes. As I stood on my porch watching the celebration unfold, Vanessa walked up beside me. "You did it," she said, a rare smile on her face. I nodded, taking in the sight of a community finally reclaiming its freedom. "No," I corrected, "we did." And for the first time since moving in, I truly felt at home. The neighborhood was finally free of the HOA's grip, but I wasn't done yet. The damage Nancy and her board had done over the years ran deep. People had been bullied, fined into submission, and forced to live under ridiculous restrictions that had no legal standing. It wasn't enough to get rid of them, I needed to make sure something like this could never happen again. That meant closing the loopholes that had allowed this mess to exist in the first place. Over the next few weeks, I worked with the City Council to draft new regulations regarding HOAs. These rules would prevent any future HOA from claiming authority over properties that were never part of their jurisdiction. The days of predatory homeowner associations strong-arming residents into compliance were over. Any HOA operating in the city had to have clear, legally binding agreements with homeowners, signed at the time of purchase, not years later when some power-hungry board decided they wanted more control. At the same time, I made sure an independent oversight committee was established to review HOA activities throughout the city. No more secret bank accounts. No more fabricated fines. If an HOA wanted to operate, they would be held accountable. While I handled things on the legal end, the neighborhood itself was undergoing a transformation. Without Nancy's iron grip dictating what was acceptable, people started making changes, real changes. Homes that had been forced into uniformity now reflected the personalities of the owners. Gardens flourished with colors that had once been deemed out of compliance. Kids rode bikes without fear of being told they were disrupting the peace. It was as if the entire community had taken a deep breath and realized they could finally live on their own terms. One evening, a group of neighbors gathered outside my house, not with complaints or concerns, but with an invitation. They were planning an official celebration for the neighborhood's freedom, and they wanted me to be part of it. The night of the event, the entire cul-de-sac was filled with people. Tables were set up with food, music played from speakers someone had set up, and for the first time since moving in, I saw genuine joy on everyone's faces. It wasn't just about celebrating the end of the HOA, it was about reclaiming the sense of community that had been stolen from them. As I made my way through the crowd, a man approached me. He was older, with deep lines on his face and the kind of presence that came from years of standing his ground. "I never thought I'd see the day," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Lived here for 15 years, and I can't tell you how many times I wanted to fight back, but they had us convinced we didn't have a choice." "You always had a choice," I said. "They just made sure you didn't realize it." He nodded thoughtfully. "Whatever you didn't just get rid of them, you gave people their confidence back. That was the real victory." As the night went on, I spoke with more residents, each one sharing stories of how the HOA had made their lives miserable. Some had been fined for the most ridiculous things. One man had been charged over a supposed improperly parked bicycle on his own porch. Another woman had been threatened with legal action because she had put up a small wooden fence in her backyard. The more stories I heard, the clearer it became. Nancy hadn't just been running an HOA. She had been ruling over people's lives, forcing them into submission through fear. And now that fear was gone. Near the end of the night, I stepped up onto a small platform someone had set up, clearing my throat to get everyone's attention. "This fight wasn't just about getting rid of an HOA," I said. "It was about proving that no one has the right to control your home but you. If there's one thing I hope we take away from this, it's that power only exists when people allow it. They tried to control you because they thought you wouldn't fight back, but you did, and now this neighborhood is yours again." Applause erupted around me, and for the first time since moving in, I truly felt like I belonged here. Nancy had thought she could force me into submission. She had believed she was untouchable, but in the end, all it took was someone willing to stand up and say no. And now she was gone, the HOA was dismantled, the people were free. And Oak Ridge would never be the same again. With the HOA officially dissolved and Nancy facing serious charges, the neighborhood was finally reclaiming itself. The relief was palpable, but there was still one thing left to do: make sure the damage done by years of mismanagement was fully repaired. The first step was addressing the money that had been stolen. The city's audit had uncovered over $50,000 in misappropriated funds. Most of it had gone directly into Nancy's personal accounts, but some had been funneled through bogus maintenance fees and inflated contractor payments. Legally, that money belonged to the homeowners who had been forced to pay into an organization that had no right to take their money in the first place. I wasn't about to let that slide. Working with the city's financial department, we set up a reimbursement fund. Every homeowner who had been forced to pay illegal dues or fines could submit a claim, and as soon as Nancy's assets were liquidated, which was now a certainty given the fraud charges against her, the money would be distributed back to them. The city attorney made sure of that. With that in motion, there was still the issue of fixing the damage left behind. The HOA had prioritized control over actual upkeep. Certain areas of the neighborhood were in desperate need of repairs. The clubhouse, once a pristine meeting place, had been neglected, while HOA board members poured funds into their own interests. The community pool had been closed for years due to budget constraints, even though financial records showed that plenty of money had been collected for its maintenance. It was time to undo the neglect. A few weeks after the HOA's collapse, I met with a group of homeowners in the old clubhouse. The room had once been a place where people were lectured, fined, and intimidated. Now, it was filled with neighbors who were ready to take real action. A contractor had been hired to assess the damages, and the homeowners were eager to take part in the repairs. Some had backgrounds in construction, others in landscaping. People who had never spoken to each other under Nancy's rule were now working together to rebuild. The pool was the first thing to be addressed. The HOA had let it sit untouched for years, claiming the cost of maintenance was too high. In reality, the funds had been redirected into Nancy's personal accounts. Now, with the HOA's frozen assets being repurposed, the pool was restored within weeks. The cracked pavement was replaced, the filtration system repaired, and by the time summer arrived, families were using it for the first time in nearly a decade. The clubhouse itself was next. The oppressive atmosphere it once held was gone. No longer a place of control, it was being turned into a true community center where events could be held without fear of fines or restrictions. Volunteers painted, replaced broken fixtures, and removed the HOA's ridiculous rule boards that had once dictated everything from lawn height to acceptable curtain colors. With every improvement, the neighborhood transformed. One evening, as I walked through the streets, I noticed something striking. People were outside, talking, gathering, enjoying their homes in ways they hadn't before. Without the HOA breathing down their necks, they were finally living. Kids played in driveways without fear of being reprimanded for excessive noise. Homeowners decorated their porches with lights, plants, and furniture that suited their tastes instead of outdated guidelines. The fear was gone. At the same time, the citywide policy changes I had pushed through were taking effect. Other neighborhoods that had suffered under similar HOA abuses were starting to challenge their own leadership. Some HOAs had already begun voluntarily stepping down, realizing that their unchecked power was no longer tolerated. Nancy's trial came faster than expected. Given the overwhelming evidence against her, she had little choice but to accept a plea deal. She avoided the worst possible sentence, but she wasn't walking away unscathed. She was required to pay restitution to the neighborhood, and her assets, including the second home she had secretly purchased, were seized. She left town shortly after. No one knew exactly where she went, and no one cared. With her gone, the last remnants of her influence disappeared. The board members who had once followed her lead quietly faded into the background, some even moving away to escape the shame of their involvement. And Oak Ridge thrived. By the time the next year rolled around, it was unrecognizable from the neighborhood I had first moved into. Not because of massive structural changes, but because the people had taken back control of their own lives. The community was stronger than ever, not because of an HOA, but in spite of it. One afternoon, I was sitting on my porch when an older woman from down the street walked up. She had been one of the first to speak out against the HOA once it started crumbling, and she had been instrumental in rallying the neighborhood. She handed me a tin of homemade cookies, a warm smile on her face. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, "for everything." I nodded, accepting the gesture. It wasn't just me, it was all of us. She laughed, "Maybe, but we needed someone to remind us that we could fight back." As she walked away, I leaned back in my chair, watching the street in front of me. Kids rode their bikes freely, neighbors chatted on their front lawns, and the oppressive silence that had once blanketed the area was gone. Oak Ridge wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a home.